Go.
My name is Ryan Zinley Schmidt, and I am an abolitionist. I am against slavery. I wasn't always an abolitionist. In fact, at one time in my life, I made money off of slavery. Like many of my former European business friends, I made a lot of money off of slavery. But at the time, I didn't know that I was contributing to such human cruelty. I was in the textile business. I had a factory in Portugal which produced men's and women's clothing. I sold them to wealthy Europeans living in Africa. In exchange for the textiles, I was paid in slaves. The slaves were sent by boat to the American colonies where they were exchanged for sugar and other products. The products were then sold back in Europe. For quite some time, I didn't see anything wrong with how I made my living. It wasn't until I was traveling in Africa that I met a former slave named Moises. One day, 3 years ago, Moises and some other men from his village were taken prisoner by a group of white men. When his wife tried to stop them, she was hit and beaten, as were his children. He was forced to leave his home and family with nothing but the clothes on his back. When some of the other men resisted, they were killed, so Moises cooperated. He was put in the cargo area of a ship with hundreds of other African slaves. Conditions in the ship were not fit for an animal, let alone a fellow human being. There was no food, very little water, and no fresh air because the slaves were not allowed on deck. Anyone who asked for food or made any kind of trouble was beaten. Hundreds died during the passage. They were the lucky ones. Moses prayed every night that he too would die. Can you imagine yourself as a young man praying that you were dead? When he finally reached the island of Barbados, he was sent to work at a sugar plantation. There he worked every day, from sunrise to sunset, grinding sugarcane. Once, when he became ill and could not work, he was severely beaten. He received one meager meal per day of spoiled meat and hard bread. For 2 years, Moses worked hard every day, and his captors noticed. They wanted more hard workers like him, so Moses came up with a plan. He told them that all the men from his village were all cousins of his and equally hard-working. He told them that he would take them to Africa and take them to his village. They agreed. They sailed back to Africa and began making their way to his village. But one night, when he was not in chains, he escaped and ran to his village to tell them to flee because the white men were coming. But when he arrived at his village, he found no one there. All of the men had already been taken as slaves, and all of the women and children had moved away. He searched for his wife and children, but he never found them. Eventually he made his way to a city where I found him in a marketplace, offering a full day's work in exchange for a piece of bread. After I heard his story, I vowed never to engage in the slave trade again. There are alternatives. No one should have to be a slave. Everyone should be paid for their work. People like me were making enough money to be able to pay workers. No human should be taken away from his family, starved, beaten, and worked to death with no hope for the future. If the only hope is wishing that you were dead, how can we call ourselves human beings? I urge you to join me in my effort to end slavery.